Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something pretty ambitious, I think. It's a fascinating exploration of how we even understand the world around us.
Yeah, it's about the hidden foundations, what we consider knowledge and how those deep structures, well, they've quietly shifted over centuries.
Exactly, and it's a journey that might genuinely reshape how you think about, well, thinking itself.
It really might.
Yeah.
We're diving into Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, which is frankly a groundbreaking piece of work, revolutionary even.
And it's not like a standard history of science book, right? Or just a list of ideas through time.
Not at all. Foucault actually calls it an archaeology.
Oh.
So think of it less like history and more like digging beneath the surface.
Okay.
But instead of artifacts, you're uncovering these underlying rules, often unconscious rules, that governed what actually counted as knowledge in different eras.
Right, the invisible rules.
Precisely. And he calls these deep structures the episteme. So our mission today really is to explore these subtle but really profound changes in how we perceive things, how we name them, how we order the world.
And this ties into the concept of discourse, doesn't it? Which is central here.
Absolutely. We'll be highlighting the historical roots and interpretations of discourse. For Foucault, it's not just talk. It's the whole system, the framework that makes it possible to even speak, think, or understand certain things within a particular historical period. It defines what can be known.
So why should you, listening now, care about these maybe seemingly abstract ideas, old classification systems, philosophy shifts?
Well, it's surprisingly relevant. Understanding Foucault's episteme and discourse gives you this really powerful lens. You start to see how our current knowledge systems are put together. You realize that what we often take for granted, a simple truth or fact, is actually deeply shaped by these historical conditions.
It even influences our everyday thinking, right? Like, why is the grocery store laid out that way? Why do we value certain jobs or skills?
Exactly. These aren't just random choices. They often stem from these deeper, unspoken ways of ordering the world. Part of the prevailing discourse, you could say.
I promise. You're likely going to have some real aha moments by the end of this about the very fabric of your own understanding. And we're drawing directly from the order of things itself, using extensive excerpts to give you a direct line into Foucault's thinking.
Yeah, straight from the source. A, the challenge of order. Borges and Las Meninas.
Okay, so where does Foucault even begin this archaeological dig? Not with a dry historical overview, surprisingly.
No, he starts with something almost like a riddle, an absurdity, really. He uses this anecdote from Jorge Luis Borges about a fictional Chinese encyclopedia.
Right, the bizarre list of animals. It includes things like belonging to the emperor, embalmed, frenzied, suckling pigs.
Sirens, fabulous ones, stray dogs, those included in the present classification.
Yep.
Those that from a long way off look like flies. Those that have just broken the water pitcher.
Yeah.
I mean, the list just goes on. It's utterly nonsensical by our standards.
And that's exactly the point. What's so disturbing about it? Foucault says it shatters our common ways of naming, it destroys syntax, it makes it impossible to find a common locus. A coherent order.
It creates this deep unease.
Profound unease. He calls it a heterotopia, a space where things are arranged so differently, so incompatibly, that you can't find a common ground for them. It undermines language itself.
Unlike a utopia, which is comforting even if it's imaginary.
Exactly. Heterotopias are disturbing. They contest grammar, dissolve myths. This loss of what is common to place and name, this feeling of utopia or aphasia, Foucault says, highlights a fundamental anxiety we have about language and classification. Can we actually order the world neatly?
It really strips away those comfortable assumptions.
It does. And then Foucault pivots. He connects this sort of conceptual chaos to a visual masterpiece. Velázquez's painting Las Meninas from 1656. Ah, yes, the painting in the palace. It's got so much going on. You see Velázquez himself, the painter, at his easel.
But his back is mostly to us, looking out from the painting.
Right. And then there's the Infanta Margarita, the young princess with her maids of honor, the meninas and dwarves, a dog.
But the really intriguing part, as you mentioned earlier, is the mirror on the back wall.
Reflecting the king and queen, who must be standing where we, the viewers, are.
Precisely. And there's also that open door in the background with a figure silhouetted on the stairs. It's a whole complex web of looking.
So Foucault doesn't just see a portrait.
Not at all. He reads Las Meninas as a representation of representation itself. The painting isn't just showing something, it's questioning the very act of seeing, of knowing, of representing.
The gazes are key then. The painter looking out, the Infanta maybe looking at the king and queen or the painter.
It blurs all the lines. Observer observed, the act of depiction itself. And crucially, we, the spectators, are pulled into this space. We're visible to the painter, but invisible to ourselves within the scene. It creates what Foucault calls a privileged and inescapable position for the viewer.
So the painting acts as a kind of threshold.
A visual threshold, exactly. A symbolic bridge between two different ways of knowing, two different epistemes. It foreshadows the huge shift Foucault is about to analyze. It's like Velázquez captured the dissolving edge of one worldview and the dawn of another. B, the Renaissance episteme, the reign of resemblance from Chapter 2, the prose of the world.
Okay, so after setting the stage with Borges and Velázquez, Foucault dives back in time to the Renaissance. And he asks us to imagine a way of knowing that's really quite alien to us now.
Yeah, forget rigid classification or modern scientific causality for a moment. Renaissance knowledge was built on something much more fluid. A pervasive belief in hidden connections, deep patterns running through everything.
The reign of resemblance, he calls it, or similitudes.
Exactly. And he breaks down how these similitudes worked, identifying 4 key forms. The first one is convenientia.
Convenientia. Like convenience. Proximity.
Sort of, but deeper.
Yeah.
It's the idea that things, just by being next to each other, by touching or being adjacent, actually influence each other, share properties. It's proximity as a sign of a hidden relationship.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, think about the body and soul. For the soul to reside in the body, it had to become sort of denser, and through this closeness, this convenientia, the soul receives the body's movements, its passions, or how plants were thought to communicate with animals, and everything communicated with man. It's about resonance through adjacency.
Fascinating. So adjacency creates a kind of bond. What's the next form?
That would be emulatio.
Yeah.
Think of this less as direct contact and more like mirroring, distant echoes, things reflecting each other across space without needing to touch. Like how the human face, with its 2 eyes, was seen as mirroring the 2 great lights of the heavens, the sun and moon. Or Paracelsus saying man contains stars within himself. The universe as a grand hall of mirrors.
Right. Distant similarities. So we have adjacency, convenientia, and mirroring, emulatio. How does it get broader, more universal?
That brings us to analogy. Foucault describes this as the principle that allows all figures in the universe to be drawn together. And crucially, man is the center point, the privilege point or fulcrum for all these analogies.
So man is the key.
Man is the microcosm. His body proportions echo the heavens, animals, plants, the earth itself. Foucault uses that example of Pierre Bellon's 16th century drawing comparing human and bird skeletons.
Yeah, I've seen that. Looks like early comparative anatomy to us.
But a Renaissance eye would see resemblance, Foucault argues. Proof of the universal analogical structure of creation, with man at the center, linking everything. Not a scientific comparison of function.
Got it. And the 4th pillar?
Sympathy. This one implies a more active force, attraction, repulsion, influence across distance, things drawn together or pushed apart.
Like magnetism.
Kind of, yeah. Could be attraction, like things that benefit each other, or even conflict, like predator and prey, the rat and the crocodile example Foucault uses. This constant interplay of sympathy and antipathy keeps everything distinct, yet connected in this dynamic web. It maintains the world's coherence through these invisible forces.
So these 4 types of resemblance, convenientia, emulatio, analogy, sympathy, they weren't just abstract ideas, were they? They had to be somehow visible.
Exactly. And that's where the system of signatures comes in. Signatures were the visible marks, the clues on the surface of things that pointed to their hidden resemblances or properties.
Like the walnut looking like a brain, so it must be good for headaches.
Precisely that kind of thinking. Or the shape of a plant leaf indicating which organ it could heal. The world was seen as this vast open book, covered in signs, blazons, characters, ciphers, almost like hieroglyphics that needed deciphering.
So knowledge wasn't about experimentation in our sense, but about interpretation.
Fundamentally, yes. Knowledge was interpretation, deciphering these signatures to understand the underlying resemblances. But Foucault points out a circularity here.
How so?
Well, resemblances need signatures to be known, but signatures are themselves only visible because they resemble something else. It leads to this potentially infinite sliding over the great circle of similitudes. You're always interpreting signs that point to resemblances that are revealed by more signs.
It sounds endless.
It was. And that was seen as the richness of the world, not a flaw. And language, crucially, was embedded right within this system.
Not just a tool to describe the world, but part of it.
Absolutely. Language was part of the fabric of the world. Words weren't arbitrary labels. They held a primal connection to the things they named, reflecting those deep resemblances.
And writing was particularly important, more so than speech.
Yes, Foucault emphasizes the preeminence of writing in this era. Think printing. Rediscovered ancient texts, religious scriptures. Spoken words were seen as transitory and precarious, but written signs held the enduring truth. Hebrew was even considered the original language, the common language of God, Adam, and the animals, containing the true names of things.
So knowledge becomes commentary, essentially.
Exactly. The main task was interpreting, an infinite commentary on the original text of the world and its scriptures. Language itself contained this inner principle of proliferation, always generating more commentary, more interpretation, never reaching a final definitive statement. You were always trying to recover a more primal meaning hidden beneath the surface. Words and things were deeply, deeply interwoven. See the Great Rupture, Don Quixote, the dawn of classicism from chapter 3, representing.
Okay, so we have this rich, dense world built on resemblance and interpretation. But systems change, right? Foucault identifies a major break, a great rupture.
He does. And interestingly, he pins it, symbolically at least, on a fictional character, Don Quixote.
The man from La Mancha. How does he fit in?
Foucault sees Don Quixote as the hero of the same, the last knight of resemblance. He's wandering the world desperately seeking these similitudes, these analogies. He sees inns as castles, windmills as giants, because his mind is still operating by the old Renaissance rules. He's trapped in the familiar plane of the analog.
But the world around him isn't playing by those rules anymore.
Precisely. Foucault says Quixote's very being is nothing but language, text, printed pages. He is the written word, wandering through a world where words and things no longer inherently resemble each other.
So the magic of resemblance becomes madness.
Yes. The ability to decipher the world through hidden connections is reduced to delusion, absurdity. Similitudes become deceptive, signs become unreliable. Don Quixote represents the breakdown of that old episteme.
And this makes his story the first modern work of literature, according to Foucault.
That's his argument. Because in Don Quixote, language breaks its old, intimate kinship with things. It becomes something separate, enters its lonely sovereignty, which is what literature is. For Foucault, language representing language, not directly plugged into the world's order.
And resemblance gets pushed to the edges.
To the realm of madness and imagination. This rupture, Foucault says, gives rise to two key figures on the outer edge of our culture. The madman, who sees resemblance everywhere and mistakes things, and the poet, who strains to find that lost language of resemblance hidden beneath the signs.
It's a profound shift. Language isn't being the world anymore. It's trying to represent it.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a literary feeling. It was a deep intellectual shift, exemplified by Descartes.
Right, the Cartesian critique.
Descartes basically denounced resemblance as messy, a confused mixture. He argued for rigorous analysis, breaking things down into identity, difference, measurement, order. Comparison wasn't about finding vague kinship anymore. It was about finding precise, simple natures, like shape, size, motion, through clear intuition and deduction.
Clarity, distinctness, certainty.
That became the new ideal. And this ushered in the classical thought of the 17th century. Analysis replaced analogy. Every resemblance had to be rigorously proven by comparison, measured, ordered.
No more infinite interpretation.
The goal shifted to complete enumeration and absolutely certain knowledge of identities and differences. The mind's main job became discriminating, establishing clear identities and necessary links in a series.
And this separated different kinds of knowledge.
Yes, like erudition studying old texts split off from science, which became about observing and discriminating facts. Knowledge became about building clear, verifiable tables, not deciphering ancient secrets.
And what happened to signs if they weren't signatures pointing to hidden resemblances?
Their role totally changed. It wasn't about uncovering an ancient word. It was about fabricating a precise language, ideally like mathematics, for calculation and clear representation.
So the sign became absolutely crucial, but in a different way.
Hugely crucial, because the sign now was thought, in a way. Foucault's phrase is dense. The representativity of the representation insofar as it is representable.
Okay, let's try to break that down.
It means the sign's job is primarily to represent other representations, our ideas, our concepts, in a clear, orderable way. It doesn't necessarily connect directly to the thing in itself anymore, but to how we think about the thing. This makes the system of signs fundamental to all knowledge, logic, and order in the classical age. It's the backbone of the new discourse.
Right. This leads to the underlying structure, the grid of this classical episteme.
Yes, Foucault identifies three interconnected concepts that form this grid: the hypothesis, taxonomia, and genesis. Think of them not as separate subjects, but as the interconnected operating principles.
Okay, what are they?
Hypothesis is the overarching science of order itself, especially for simple things. Think universal method, logic, algebra, the tools for establishing equalities, attributions, truth. It's the fundamental logic layer.
Like the basic formulas.
Exactly. Then taxonomia is the science of ordering complex things. This is classification, creating tables, establishing identities and differences. It's the method of creating ordered systems, like Linnaeus did for plants and animals. Foucault calls it a qualitative mathesis. It's how you structure the information using the logic of mathesis.
So the categories, the columns and rows in the grand spreadsheet of knowledge.
Perfect analogy. And finally, genesis. This relates to order in series, sequences, development over time, chronology, but viewed as an ordered progression, how elements are arranged within a sequence.
So taxonomia fits within mathesis, and genesis is sort of embedded within taxonomia.
That's the idea. It's a nested structure, the general configuration of knowledge in the classical age. And what's fascinating is how this underlying grid connected fields that seem really different to us now.
Like the examples you mentioned earlier, Port Royal logic and grammar.
Exactly. They shared the same analytical structure. Or Condillac, connecting theories of knowledge, signs, language, and economics. Adam Smith, writing on both wealth and the origin of languages. Linnaeus wanting a taxonomia universalis for everything.
They were all using the same underlying operating system, the same episteme.
Precisely. They were all operating within this discourse of representation and order.
The logic of language, from chapter 4. Speaking.
Okay, so let's see how this classical grid mathesis, taxonomia, genesis actually played out in specific areas. Foucault looks closely at language first.
Right, and language in the classical age had this kind of dual status. It was incredibly important, preeminent even, because it was the tool for representing thought clearly. But at the same time, it was meant to be almost invisible, transparent.
Its job was to accurately mirror thought, not get in the way.
Exactly, which led to this intense critique of words. There was a big push for a perfectly analytic language, getting rid of vague vocabulary that could muddy the waters of science and philosophy.
So precision was key.
Utterly key. And alongside that, detailed analysis of syntax, rhetoric, word order, how language actually structures representation, both spatially, through figures of speech, and sequentially, through grammar. They wanted a grammar that perfectly mirrored logical thought.
And Foucault highlights one word in particular, doesn't he? The verb to be.
Yes, this is a really striking point. He argues the verb to be was singularly important in this episteme. It was seen as the representation of being in language and also the representative being of language itself.
Wow, okay. What does that mean practically?
It's the word that links nouns, subjects, and predicates. It affirms existence, and crucially, it makes language capable of being true or false. Other signs might just designate or point, but is makes an assertion about reality. It carries the weight of ontology.
So it's fundamental to linking language and truth in this period.
Absolutely. Foucault notes that its later separation from pure grammar in the 19th century is what opened the door for modern philosophy's obsession with the link between being and language. Think Hegel, Nietzsche, and Mallarmé. But in the classical age, to be held it all together.
And it wasn't just nouns and verbs. The smaller words mattered too.
Definitely. Foucault talks about the accessory words, prepositions, conjunctions, articles, all those little connecting bits. They were crucial for showing the interior network of relationships within a proposition. Their meaning wasn't fixed like a noun, it was relative, depending entirely on the structure they helped create. They were the grammatical glue.
So how did they think language originated? Did they just assume it was given?
Not exactly. Foucault discusses the idea of language of action, moving beyond simple imitation versus convention. The idea was that maybe initial cries or gestures didn't resemble anything specific, but reflection afterwards, through voluntary agreement or convention, could establish resemblances between words and ideas.
So convention creates the links.
Convention creates the horizontal links between words, establishing a shared system. But there's still that vertical gap, the fundamental difference between words and things that language tries to bridge through representation. It's a bit complex, but it avoids a purely naive imitation theory.
And this connects to how they viewed writing systems, alphabetical versus symbolic.
Yes. Alphabetical writing was seen as superior because it analyzes sounds according to the rules of reason itself. It breaks language down into basic components, making analysis and progress possible. It's linear, rational.
Like the classical mind itself.
Exactly. Symbolic writing, like hieroglyphs or ideograms, which tried to represent things directly or spatially, was seen as stuck in the confused law of similitudes, hindering clear analytical thought. The alphabet was the tool of reason.
What about things like metaphors, figures of speech? Weren't they seen as irrational clutter?
Not entirely. Foucault points out that rhetoric, things like synecdoche or metonymy, were understood as revealing the natural mobility of language, how names shift, how meanings extend through association or analogy. It's a tropological space where language moves, but still within the overarching goal of representation.
So it all comes back to naming things correctly.
That's the bottom line for classical discourse. Foucault states it clearly. The fundamental task of classical discourse is to ascribe a name to things, and in that name, to name their being. Language, used correctly, defined reality within this system. Naming was knowing. The discourse itself constructed the order.
The order of nature, from chapter 5. Classifying?
Okay, let's shift from language to how this classical episteme tackled the natural world. Natural history people like Linnaeus, Buffon.
Right. And Foucault makes the point that this rise of natural history wasn't some backward-looking thing separate from Cartesian mechanism. They were actually products of the same episteme, authorized by the same underlying rules of analysis and order.
So classifying plants and animals fit the same mold as rational mechanics.
In terms of the underlying approach to knowledge, yes. It also involved a big shift in what history meant.
How so?
The Renaissance historian was mostly digging through old texts, compiling documents, trying to restore words. But the classical historian and the naturalist, was the prime example, undertook a meticulous examination of things themselves.
Observation became key.
Direct observation, yes. And then transcribing what you saw in smooth, neutralized, and faithful words. Natural history was seen as the purest form of this new history because it dealt directly with visible things, not mediated by old texts.
But it wasn't just any observation, right? It was systematic.
Highly systematic.
Yeah.
Foucault says the art was to be content with seeing a few things systematically. The goal was to analyze what could be clearly identified within the confused wealth of representation and then name it. Linnaeus wanted to banish all obscure similitudes. Clear, visible characteristics were paramount.
So they needed a system, a grid.
Exactly. The classification grid. Naturalists use specific parameters, form, size, number of parts, position, even substance, to define the visible characters of species. This grid created clear spaces to accommodate words, a structure for ordering all of nature.
Like building that perfect table we talked about. Every creature in its precise box based on observable traits.
Precisely. But Foucault notes it wasn't just about static boxes. Natural history also assumed a kind of continuity.
The flow between the boxes.
Sort of. They envisioned a continuous network of beings. Think of the great chain of being ideas, Boddett's linear scale, Buffon's wide woven strip. Nature was seen as fundamentally continuous, allowing for this taxonomic ordering, but they also acknowledged discontinuities, time, revolutions, catastrophes that could disrupt the order. Nature existed between the continuous table and these discontinuous events.
What about tricky things like fossils or monsters? Didn't they break the system?
Interestingly, no. Fossils, being mixed animal mineral, were seen as a prime example of resemblance, linking different realms. But taxonomia's job was to rigorously decompose them, fit them into the classification anyway. Monsters were anomalies, deviations from the norm, which actually helped define the norm. They were categorized as exceptions that proved the rule, rather than undermining the system itself.
So the system was robust enough to handle apparent contradictions.
Within its own terms, yes. And this whole process creates what Foucault calls the discourse of nature. The very act of classifying based on finding the smallest possible difference between things presupposes and reinforces the idea of nature's true continuity.
And this continuity makes language possible.
Yes, because if nature is this great uninterrupted fabric of identities and differences, then memory and language can function reliably. Comparison is possible. But crucially, Foucault insists things and words are very strictly interwoven. Nature is posited only through the grid of denominations. The discourse creates the intelligible nature it describes.
Which leads to one of Foucault's really striking points about this era, the absence of biology.
Exactly, it often throws people. Until the end of the 18th century, he argues, life does not exist. only living beings.
Yane.
Life wasn't studied as a distinct force or phenomenon in itself. It was just a category within the classification, a character used to sort things in the big table. Whether something was living or non-living wasn't the fundamental dividing line or major scientific problem. They studied living beings as objects to be ordered, not life as a concept.
That really shows how the episteme dictates what questions even get asked.
Absolutely. The idea of biology as a science of life itself simply didn't fit within the classical framework of representation and taxonomia.
The analysis of wealth from Chapter 6, exchanging.
Okay, so we've seen language and nature ordered by this classical grid. What about economics? How did they think about wealth and exchange?
The same fundamental shift from resemblance to representation occurred here too, especially regarding money.
How did the Renaissance view money?
For them, money's power came from its intrinsic value. Gold and silver were valuable in themselves. Their metallic reality was a hidden presence, a visible signature of wealth. Money could measure because it was inherently precious.
So gold is valuable because it's gold.
Pretty much. But in the 17th century, Foucault says this analysis gets flipped upside down. Money's function as a measure, its price, now rested entirely on its exchanging function, its ability to be substituted for goods.
So it's valuable because it can represent other things.
Exactly. It becomes precious because it's chosen as the universal sign for exchange, not the other way around. It signifies wealth, and because it signifies wealth so effectively, it becomes wealth in the form of a desirable sign. It's a move from inherent value to representative value.
And mercantilism fits this view.
Perfectly. Mercantilists often seemed contradictory, hoarding gold like a commodity while defining money purely as a sign. But Foucault says within the classical episteme, this made sense. Money had to be precious itself, a reliable sign, to effectively represent all other forms of wealth. Its quality as a sign made it a valuable commodity. The power was in its representation.
So there's no just price based on inherent worth anymore.
No, value becomes conventional, determined by exchange. And interestingly, time enters the equation here in a unique way. Foucault draws a parallel between the speed of money circulating and the scope of a taxonomic category.
How does that work?
Faster circulation allows money to represent more transactions, more wealth, just like a simpler, broader characteristic in taxonomy covers more species. It links the temporal dynamic of economics to the spatial logic of the classification table. It's quite ingenious, really.
And within this framework, different theories of how value is created emerged.
Yes, Foucault highlights two main opposing schools, which he argues still operated within the same basic epistemic network. First, the physiocrats, like Quesnay.
They focused on agriculture, right? Land is the source of wealth.
Exactly. They saw value arising from nature's endless fecundity. For them, exchange itself was actually costly, a subtraction of goods. Production, getting things from the earth, came first, and value existed in those goods before exchange.
Okay, production creates value. What was the opposing view?
What Foucault loosely terms the psychological theory, associated with thinkers like Condillac or Galliani, they argued value arises from human needs and desires. Exchange isn't costly. It actually creates utility by matching goods to needs.
So value comes from demand, from usefulness in exchange.
Right. Utility and price correspond. So you have these two opposing views, one grounding value in nature and production, the other in human needs and exchange. But Foucault's point is that both were trying to articulate the creation and structure of value within the overarching classical system of representation and ordered relations. They were different answers to the same kind of question posed within the same episteme. A, the age of history, from Chapter 7, the limits of representation.
All right, so the classical episteme, this world ordered by representation, analysis, and tables, seemed pretty comprehensive. But like the Renaissance view before it, it eventually reached its limits.
It did. Foucault identifies another massive shift, the grand mutation, happening around the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The very foundation, the idea that knowledge is solely about representing representations, started to crumble.
The system couldn't hold anymore.
It couldn't contain everything. New factors emerged, exterior conditions that just couldn't be squeezed into the flat table of representation.
Like what?
Well, take labor. Adam Smith's work was pivotal here. He argued labor isn't just one commodity among others or just a measure of exchange value. It's the irreducible, absolute unit of measurement, human time, human toil.
So labor exists before exchange and determines value.
Yes, labor becomes the ultimate source of all value. Production, driven by labor, now precedes circulation and exchange. This introduces a force, a reality, human effort, time, finitude that exists outside the neat system of signs representing needs or goods. It's something more fundamental.
A huge shift in economics. What about in natural history?
A similar rupture. Figures like Jussieu and Vic Desir started moving classification away from just looking at external, visible characters. They focused on the internal importance of the organs and their organic structure.
So function over form.
In a sense, yes. Life itself, the internal organizing principle, became indispensable for ordering living beings. You couldn't just arrange them by how they looked on the outside. You had to understand their internal functional organization. Life moved from being just a category on the table to being the underlying principle behind the table.
And language. Did that change too?
Radically. Scholars like William Jones, studying Sanskrit, or Enkhedel Duperron, started looking at language not just for how it represented ideas, but for its internal architecture.
It's grammar, it sounds.
Exactly. Phonetic changes, inflectional systems, how words themselves are built, and how they changed over time. Language now represents, based on this internal grammar, which Foucault calls its historical reverse side, a kind of deep internal structure that determines meaning. It wasn't just about matching words to ideas anymore. It was about understanding the historical, structural reality of language itself. B, the great reversal, from order to history.
So labor, life, language, history, these forces break through the surface of representation. What does that do to the classical worldview?
It dissolves it. Foucault says the homogeneous field of orderable representations essentially shatters. The table, the taxonomia, which was the foundation of all knowledge, becomes just a thin surface film floating above something much deeper.
And what's underneath?
Depth. European culture, Foucault argues, invents a depth in this period. Knowledge stops being about arranging things neatly on a surface and starts being about uncovering great hidden forces, origin, causality, history. The things we see are now understood as being shaped by these underlying, often invisible, temporal processes.
So it's a shift from a spatial order, the table, to a temporal one, history.
Largely, yes. History, in a much broader sense than just chronology, becomes central. And this changes everything. In economics, value is now a product of historical labor, not just a sign in an exchange. Economics becomes tied to anthropology, to understanding man as a finite being, defined by his labor, his needs, his mortality. Homo economicus is born wrestling with scarcity and time.
And in natural history, Cuvier plays a big role here.
Immense. Cuvier shifted classification so that life, that non-perceptible functional aspect, became the basis. Being classifiable wasn't just about fitting into a table, it was an intrinsic property of the living being's organization.
So the universal table disappears.
Yes, and the idea of nature as one single, smoothly ordered space vanishes too. Life creates distinct forms, bound in upon themselves, each with its own internal logic, its own enigma of a force.
How did Cuvier see connections between organisms, then?
Through two new kinds of continuity. First, the great biological functions, respiration, digestion that run across different species. Second, through comparative anatomy, tracing the development and relationships of specific organs and series. But he also emphasized discontinuity biological incompatibilities, the crucial role of the conditions of existence for each organism.
This sounds much more dynamic, less static.
Much more. The organism is now in constant interaction with its environment, subject to the pressures of survival, the threat of death. Foucault contrasts Cuvier sharply with Lamarck. Lamarck, with his smooth evolutionary scale, was still thinking in terms of classical continuity. Cuvier, emphasizing discontinuity, function, and conditions of existence, paved the way for a true history of nature, for evolutionary thought. It's a radical break.
And what about language? How did the focus on internal structure change things?
It led to the birth of philology, with figures like Bopp and Grimm. The word itself, like the biological character, lost its primary job as just a representation. Its essence was now seen in its form, its sounds, its grammatical changes over time, its inflections.
So comparing languages changed too.
Completely. Instead of looking for universal roots based on meaning, they started doing direct, lateral comparisons of grammatical structures, phonetic systems. Languages were grouped by formal proximity, by their internal architecture, their system of inflections.
Like comparing the underlying code.
That's a good way to put it. This introduced a new kind of historicity in language, not just a timeline, but understanding the internal laws of change and development within language families. You could compare Sanskrit Greek, Latin, German systematically at the same time to uncover their shared structures and reconstruct their history. Language became an object with its own complex internal history.
And Foucault links this change, this shift where language becomes an object of study in itself, to the emergence of literature.
Yes, it's an intriguing point. He suggests that literature, as a special self-aware use of language, emerges as a distinct category right around this time in the early 19th century, precisely when language stops being a transparent window onto thought and buries itself within its own material history. Language itself becomes thicker, more opaque, something to be explored for its own sake. See The Human Sciences and the Erasure of Man, concluding sections.
So all these shifts, labor creating value, life organizing structure, language having its own history, they completely dismantled the old classical way of knowing.
The old discourse, the grid of representation, just ceased to function as the primary organizer. The scaffolding collapsed.
And Foucault makes a really interesting point about man in the classical age. He says there couldn't really be a science of man back then. Why not?
Because in the classical episteme, man was the one doing the representing, the knowing. The link between I think and I am was sort of self-evident within that system of representation. Man was the subject, the viewpoint, not an object out there to be studied like a plant or word. Language, as the link between representation and being, excluded a science of the being who represents.
But then, with the Great Mutation, man does become an object of study.
Yes, suddenly, the knowledge of man appears right alongside modern biology, economics, and philology. As these fields gain their new depth, focusing on life, labor, and language history, man himself emerged as something to be analyzed empirically.
This leads to that tricky concept Foucault uses, man as an empirico-transcendental doublet. What on earth does that mean?
It's dense, for sure. Essentially, it means man in the modern episteme occupies this weird dual position. He's an empirical object, something we can study scientifically, his body, his psyche, his society. But he's also the transcendental subject, the condition that makes knowledge possible in the first place. His consciousness, his reason, his history.
So we're studying the thing that is doing the studying.
Exactly. We're both the object on the operating table and the surgeon holding the scalpel, simultaneously. Foucault says this leads to analyses trying to bridge the gap, looking at the biological conditions of knowledge, like perception, or the historical cultural conditions, like ideology, always trying to grasp how this empirical being gives rise to knowledge itself.
And this ties into another of Foucault's big provocative conclusions, the fundamental incompatibility between man and language.
Yes, he argues that throughout Western thought, the being of man and the being of language have never really been able to fully grasp or articulate each other. There's always this gap, this inerasable hiatus. Modern thought tries to grapple with this, often revealing the double, the simultaneous presence of opposites, like the empirical and the transcendental, the conscious and the unconscious, thought and the unthought. Man can't seem to fully capture himself in language.
Which makes the position of the human sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, quite difficult, doesn't it?
Very precarious, according to Foucault. They're kind of stuck in the gaps between the big modern fields of biology, economics, and philology, life, labor, language. They risk falling into anthropologism, reducing everything to psychology or sociology if they don't navigate these relationships carefully.
What is their main focus then?
They study man as he lives, speaks, and produces. They act almost like a mirror, reflecting the findings of the sciences of life, labor, and language back onto man himself, constantly leading back to the analytic of finitude, the study of man as a limited, historical, mortal being. Their key task often becomes uncovering the non-conscious, the hidden structures that shape human experience.
And history plays a special role here.
A unique role. Foucault calls it the mother of all the sciences of man, but it's more fundamental than just being one among them. History provides the very ground, the context, in which man as a knowable object even appears.
What about psychoanalysis and ethnology? Foucault seems to single them out.
He gives them a privileged position, not necessarily because they're more scientific, but because they directly confront the unconscious, the hidden rules and structures within individuals, psychoanalysis, and cultures, ethnology. They are constantly questioning, probing the limits of conscious knowledge, revealing the deep, often unseen, formal structures that shape us. They embody that principle of dissatisfaction, always digging deeper into the discourse of the human.
Which brings us to that famous, chilling final line, the erasure of man.
Right. Foucault speculates. If the current arrangements of knowledge, the ones that created this figure of man in the 19th century, were to shift again, just as the classical system collapsed, then man, as we currently conceive him, might simply disappear, erased, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea.
Wow. It's a powerful reminder that even our concept of humanity isn't fixed forever. It's a product of a particular historical way of knowing, a particular discourse.
Exactly. It's contingent on the episteme. Hashtag tag shag out.
What an incredible journey through the order of things. It really makes you pause and think about the foundations of, well, everything we think we know. The idea that these epistemes, these hidden structures and discourses, shape truth itself. It's almost unsettling.
It is unsettling, and that's part of Foucault's point, I think. It challenges our deeply held belief in objective, unchanging truth. But he's not necessarily saying nothing is true. He's asking us to look at the conditions that make certain statements count as true in a particular time and place.
Right, the rules of the game for knowledge.
Exactly. When the Renaissance scholars saw signatures in plants, that was their reality, their way of ordering things, dictated by the discourse of resemblance. When the classical naturalist made tables, that was their truth, based on representation and analysis. Our own common sense operates within a framework too, even if we don't see it.
So the big question for us listening today is, what are the hidden rules shaping our understanding now? What's our current episteme, our dominant discourse?
That's the challenge Foucault leaves us with, especially now with, the explosion of information, digital technologies, AI, are these creating new ways of ordering knowledge, new forms of discourse.
If Foucault saw this historical tension between the being of man and the being of language, what new tensions might be emerging for us between, say, human consciousness and artificial intelligence, or networked knowledge and individual understanding?
Absolutely. What new face might be getting drawn in the sand and what older one might be starting to fade. It invites us to be archaeologists of our own present, to look for those rules that come into play in the very existence of discourse all around us.
So the next time you're scrolling through a feed or using a search engine or even just categorizing emails, maybe pause and think, what are the underlying rules here? What system is ordering this information for me? How is this discourse shaping what I see as relevant or true?
It's a powerful exercise. It encourages a critical awareness of the frameworks we inhabit, the often invisible order of things that structures our reality.
Definitely food for thought, a lot to mull over. Thank you for guiding us through such a complex but rewarding text.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to revisit Foucault.
And thank you all for diving deep with us today. Until next time, keep digging.